Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 135. Today's guest is Molly Spencer. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. On today's show, I'm talking with the poet Molly Spencer. Molly Spencer is a poet, critic, and editor. Her debut collection, If the House, published in 2019, won the Brittingham Prize, judged by Carl Phillips. A second collection, Hinge, published in 2020, won the Crab Orchard Open Competition, judged by Allison Joseph. Molly's poetry has appeared in Blackbird, Field, New England Review, Plowshares, and Prairie Schooner. Her critical writing has appeared at the Georgia Review, Kenyon Review, West Branch, the Writer's Chronicle, and the Rumpus, where she is a senior poetry editor. She teaches writing at the University of Michigan's Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. I've been following Molly's poetry for quite some time now. I was first introduced to her work by the poet Hannah Stevenson, I think back in 2015. As longtime listeners may know, I'm always strongly drawn to art and writing about parenthood, especially work that engages with the parts of parenthood that aren't talked about as much. The first few poems I read of Molly's were great examples of that and really drew me in. Her two books, If the House and Hinge, which we talked about in today's conversation, engage with motherhood and domesticity, with chronic illness, with divorce, all that with the sort of honesty and critical eye that I just found breathtaking. So I was really happy to get the chance to talk with Molly about these poems. A few notes before we start. As always, when I have a writer on, I like to ask them to pick a local bookstore in their community that they'd like to support. Molly chose Literati Bookstore in Ann Arbor, Michigan. There are links in the show notes where you can order copies of both books from Literati, as well as from the Book Catapult here in San Diego and from bookshop.org. And as always, I encourage you to support your own local independent bookstore and order copies from there. Also, Molly was kind enough to give a bonus reading for patrons of the show, a poem called Rowing and Then Light, which is from her new manuscript. That reading is available to subscribers to our Patreon at patreon.com/likewisemedia, along with the full bonus audio archive, which includes readings from previous guests, including Liz Lenz, Luther Hughes, Ada Limon, David Naiman, Rachel Zucker, and many more. Once again, that's patreon.com/likewisemedia. All right, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Molly Spencer. So I've read both of your books now, and I really enjoyed both of them, particularly reading If the House sort of, just by happenstance, I happened to read it at a moment in life when the subject matter was extremely relevant for me. And
I don't know whether to say, oh, great, or, oh, I'm sorry.
Things are, it's good now. But I think mainly it was just that it was very striking to me. It was just sort of the serendipity of happening across a book that fit my life. So I always love when little moments like that happen. And so, but I was wondering if we could start off with a reading.
Sure. I chose a reading, a poem from Hinge to read today. So Hinge is my second book, technically, although I wrote it before I wrote If the House. And I kind of chose this poem because it's been very foggy where I live the last couple mornings, like such dense fog that you can kind of hardly see in front of you. And it just reminded me of a poem in Hinge that was written after a similar foggy spell, although I was living in a different state at the time. And the title comes from an Emily Dickinson poem, the number of which I don't recall and haven't hunted down, but the first line of the Emily Dickinson poem is, "Make me a picture of the sun." And so I grabbed Picture of the Sun as a title for this poem. So here's Picture of the Sun. Fog so thick it drips off the branches and swallows every noise. Once there was a childhood, and it looked like this. Earth wrapped in a cool blue cloak, many years next to each other like books on a shelf, and all the gardens opening their mouths to drink. Summer lasts forever. More babies are born, but they're happy and good sleepers. All the trees look young again, their bark lustrous, deep. a sandbox big as a hill. Apples blush in orchards late summer. Grown-ups linger over coffee. School bus runs on time. The sun is like God, warm, reliable, steamed milk and honey before bed. World on pause while we wait for a cloud come down from heaven to pass by. All this lasts until 8th grade, when they tell us the sun's a yellow dwarf, burning itself out. Meet my son, he's 7 and happy. He comes home from school today through a fog that never burned off, that crawled through the cracks in the walls. He lifts, he glides, he wheels in a vortex up the driveway, comes indoors saying, "Mom, the sun won't last forever. Really, Mom, and we're becoming extinct." Runs outside again to play. One feather falls down from his wings.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
It's so funny. I have so many opportunities to say this, but like almost every time I have a poet on and ask for a reading, I always say, I'd like you to pick what you're going to read. And I think almost every time, like maybe only once or twice has it not happened, that the guest will pick one of the poems that really stood out to me. And this has happened again.
I'm glad to help your streak along.
This has happened again. I feel like there is something about this poem in particular that struck me as a little bit of like speaking to some kind of a through line between both collections. And there's a couple of things here. The first is, this line towards the beginning that's many years next to each other, like books on a shelf, that there's something about the way both of these collections, that the poems engage with memory and time, the way that when you're remembering something, that it's happening at the same time as the things that are happening around you, if that makes sense.
Yes, that does make sense.
But also the way that this poem to me is very much about sort of a loss of innocence and a way in which the world or your life doesn't turn out the way that you had expected it might have.
Right.
And I feel like that sense is running through both books very strongly. But I wanted to see what you thought of either of these notions.
Yeah, well, I think that's probably right, although I don't know that I could have articulated that for myself. I think memory and time are two of my very kind of deep interests and obsessions as a poet. I grew up in a family where telling stories and sharing stories and remembering things together was something that we did a lot. And I kind of thought that was true for everyone. But as I went through life, I met people whose families didn't do that, and people who didn't seem to have as many memories as I did, or didn't seem to treasure memory as a thing or a concept, or memories as touchstones in their lives in the same way I did. So certainly memory and time are they're always kind of cycling in the background of my mind in my life and in my poetry. I think, yeah, definitely both books go through their own kind of loss of innocence, and certainly life not turning out the way you think it might or the way you thought it would when you set out. I remember specifically a moment when I realized that Hinge, or what became Hinge, was an elegy. And once I could start thinking about the book, or the stack of poems that was becoming a book, as an elegy, it really helped me figure out how to structure the book. It helped me think about what was missing and what there was maybe too much of and what there was not enough of. And I remember distinctly being in a conversation with someone at one AWP or another, I don't remember which now, and they were asking about what I was working on, and I told them I was working on a manuscript and it was coming, pretty close to being done, and they said, "Well, what is it?" And I said, "Well, it's an elegy." And they asked, "An elegy to what?" And that's the part that I hadn't answered for myself yet. But what I said, kind of without thinking, was it's an elegy for all of us, because life doesn't always turn out the way you think it will. And so it's mourning the life that the speaker thought they would have and trying to come to acceptance. If not, I don't think the speaker in Hinge ever gets to total comfort and the kind of consolation that a traditional elegy might provide, but at least a grim acceptance of that. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. It really does. It's interesting. I definitely have this elegiac sense of this collection. There is a sort of similar sense in If the House, but I feel like the sense of acceptance isn't quite as gray, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
That it's more... So I feel like there is a sense in both books, there is this sort of grappling with, I feel like, what does it mean to be free, particularly as a woman? Mm-hmm. And like, if we take the two books in the order of their composition as creating some kind of a narrative that might span both books, that where that narrative ends up at the end of If the House is more towards a certain kind of freedom, even if it is also a freedom that comes through a certain kind of loss. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. And I think the other thing that was true, well, first, let me back up a moment and say that memory is also very, very present, memory and time, in If the House. And I think as a person, when I was writing what became If the House, I had kind of given up on acceptance and consolation in some ways. It might help readers to know that if Hinge has a narrative, it is about the onset and the grappling with serious illness, which I did experience in my life. I was ill for probably about 10 years when my kids were very young with lupus, although it wasn't diagnosed right away. And I think as a person and as a poet, when I was writing Hinge, I think I thought that there would eventually be kind of some consolation, and I would be able to accept that my life was turning out, differently than I wanted it to, or than I had imagined it would, that I was a different kind of mom than I imagined I would be, because for a very long time, there were a lot of things that physically I could not do with my children. And I think by the time I started working on the poems that became If the House, there had been just a shift in maybe in my understanding of life and the world, and a shift in maybe what I was after in life. And I had kind of set acceptance and consolation aside and had felt a permission of sorts to just kind of say things straight the way I saw them, even if it felt uncomfortable to me, which it did at first. Felt very uncomfortable. Some of the poems that are in If the House, when I wrote them, I thought, oh boy, I don't know if I ever want anyone to see this one. And even though, as I often say, and I especially said to my mother when If the House came out, poetry is not autobiography, right? All of the events that happen in either of these books, some of them certainly did happen to me. Many of them did not. So it's not like you can read these books and know exactly what the story of my life during these years was, but you can read them and know what I was thinking about and how I was using language to try to grapple with my life. So I think by the time I got to If the House, I was older too, I was in my mid-40s when I finished If the House. And I was just kind of done waiting for acceptance or consolation and wasn't terribly interested in it anymore. And between that and the guidance of a teacher who was very important to me, my MFA thesis advisor, David Weisspiel, I felt a great permission to just kind of write what came to me and to say things, even if they weren't easy to say, and even if they weren't beautiful to hear or read.
It's interesting to hear you say that because, so for me, the poems in If the House, not every single one is about this, but I feel like the narrative of that collection is about sort of the dissolution of a marriage and sort of a profound change in life, right? Mm-hmm. And I came to those poems. I mean, I'd been following your work for several years at that point, but when I actually sat down and read the book, it was sort of in the midst of when I was going through one of the harder periods of my own divorce. And mm-hmm. there was a certain way in which, recognizing similar things in these poems that might apply to myself or might apply to my ex-wife was painful, and painful for me to either admit that these were things that I had experienced, or painful for me to admit that these may have been things that my wife experienced. At the same time, the reading of them as poetry, I really felt like there was a beauty to them, but also that in a certain sense, the beauty of it might be sort of incidental to the value of it, if that makes sense. That there was something you just said that really jumped out at me. I think what it was actually, you were saying that the poems are not autobiography, mm-hmm. right? And I know, like, especially when when the speaker of a poem uses the pronoun I, there is always a strong tendency to want to sort of conflate the poet with the speaker of the poems, which sometimes can be appropriate and sometimes can be inappropriate and sometimes can get at a certain deeper meaning and sometimes can obfuscate meaning. And this is often true with fiction as well. Oftentimes when people are writing fiction, they will use elements of their own lives as like the fertilizer of their fiction. I know, like, Alexander Chee has talked about this at great length. Mm-hmm. And people want to know, like, did this happen? But there is something, I think, that the sort of poetic truth and poetic meaning of a poem, it doesn't depend on the fact of the poems, if that makes sense. And there is something about these poems where you're describing emotions or thoughts, or patterns of emotion and thought that really, to me, reaches for something very deeply relatable. And whether or not these events took place in exactly the way they're described is almost sort of, it's not really important to whether or not the poem is meaningful. Does that make sense?
It does. And I'm glad to hear you say that. At the same time, like, I don't want to be coy. My marriage did dissolve. It didn't actually dissolve until after I finished the book, but I felt it dissolving. So yes, that If the House is at one level about, if there's an aboutness to it, about the dissolution of a marriage. But what I hope is that it's about dissolution more generally, and this maybe ties back to what I said about, having life turn out differently than I thought it would, setting aside the hope of acceptance or consolation. I think the combination of any number of things that happened both to me as an individual over the years of my life and that happened and were happening to all of us collectively as the human race or as Americans led me to a place where I think my fundamental understanding of what I knew of life and the world and what I cared about in terms of life and the world, the understanding I once had of those things had completely dissolved. And I think part of the writing of If the House was to try to understand that for myself. I don't know, all kinds of writers. I think maybe Joan Didion said it most famously, but I've heard other writers say it too, that, I write to know what I think. I write to find out what I understand. And I think that impulse is very strong in me. So I hope that the narrative events of If the House are capacious enough that the poems would work for a reader who hadn't gone through the dissolution of a marriage, but who was maybe thinking about dissolution in general. I think another thing for me that was important as I was writing the poems that became If the House. And of course, I didn't understand this at the time I was writing, but I can look back now and see that the question of whether or not language can be put to the world accurately, whether or not language can be put to experience, and how close can it get us to actually describing the world. What gets said and what doesn't, what gets disclosed and what doesn't. So the question of language and its uses, and even of poetry and its uses, was very much, I think, one of the impulses behind If the House.
It is something that really struck me about that collection, about how foregrounded language and its uses are, the ways that, for example, in the conversation poems, the way that the lineation and the lack of punctuation sort of interrupts the reading eye from being able to make sense of what is being said. Like there is those poems, more than many of the other ones, there's an actual scene being described, but it can be a little bit difficult to parse because of the way that sort of the conventions of language is being interrupted. Or with the disclosure poems, how the legal language of real estate disclosure forms is either repurposed or used as sort of a jumping off point to think about the ways that those phrases might mean something else or might inspire something else. Mm-hmm. And I mean, so as someone who has never formally studied poetry, I think a fair amount about like what a poem even is. And this is something that a lot of people have tried to make stabs at making a definition of what a poem is, and they're all a little bit dissatisfying, but we all sort of agree that it has something to do with heightened language and form and something like that.
Right.
And I'm taking kind of a roundabout way of getting where I'm going, so I hope you'll bear with me.
Sure, of course.
Sometimes I'm just sort of thinking out loud. What I'm reminded of is like a third, perhaps, thread that are all kind of coming together in my head right now. I had this English professor in college who, in one of his first lectures, he was talking about this idea. It was almost tangential to what we were actually talking about, that language can't actually communicate anything that you don't already know. And he held up a piece of chalk and said, "What is this?" And somebody said, "It's chalk." And he said, "I don't want to know what it's called. I want to know what it is." And then somebody said, "It's calcium carbonate," because I went to a science and tech school. And they said, "I don't want to know what it's made out of. I want to know what it is." And it's something that you've been writing with. I don't want to know what I do with it. I want to know what it is. And that sort of went on and on. But I feel like there's something taking all of these together about the ways that language can or cannot be communicative, and what a poem can do, that even through these limitations, there's something about the poem that is able to communicate something, whether it's doing so obliquely or indirectly, that can't be done in any other way. And I find that really fascinating. And I guess I want to know if you have any thoughts along those lines.
I do. Well, first of all, I disagree with your professor that said that language can't communicate anything you don't already know. I think the only reason I write is to find out things that I don't already know. And I use language to do that. It's actually making me think of something from Atal Adnan's Sea and Fog. It's a little quote that I have jotted down here at my desk. Poetry reaches the unsaid and leaves it unsaid. So I guess I see language, or I use language as a poet, as kind of a dowsing stick to figure out what I might understand of the world and to reach the limits of that understanding, knowing that there's always going to be mystery beyond some point, right? Mm-hmm. And that language can only get us so far, but also that there is a way of knowing in that space, that mystery beyond language. If all we're talking about is kind of didactic knowledge, fact-based knowledge, then perhaps your former professor has a point. But I think one of poetry's valuable and beautiful ways of knowing is that through language, it brings us into this space of silence or mystery or, the nothing that is, if we take the last line of the Wallace Stevens poem, The Snowman, and that there is a way of knowing beyond language that poetry can help us access.
Yeah. I almost feel like, when you're talking about, writing to know what you think, or writing language as a tool for discovery about your own way of thinking or feeling, right? Mm-hmm. That even still with that, and maybe this is just how I am and not how everybody is, but that because I do the same kind of thing, I will use writing or also other creative tools. Like I'm a photographer as well, and will use different creative outlets as a way of sort of locating myself. But there's still some kind of intuitive leap that has to happen between where the language ends and where the understanding happens. Mm-hmm. I think that's pretty much the same thing that you're saying, and that what you pointed to with that quotation about poetry going up to the unsaid and then leaving it unsaid. What comes after that, at least for me, the thought is that it may be unsaid, but it's still felt. Does that make sense?
Yes, that does make sense. And I would say that it may be unsaid, but it's still felt. And I think it's even more than felt. It's a different form of understanding than language or feeling can deliver, I guess, is kind of how I think about it. And it's often for me, I guess, as a reader, my experience as a reader is often that a poem will work on me, work in my mind, in my consciousness for some time before I think I know what I learned from that poem. So there's the thing that's unsaid, there's the limit of language, there's feeling, and then there's this other way of knowing, a slow way of knowing, maybe, that I think sometimes brings us to a particular insight and sometimes maybe doesn't even, but it has worked in our minds in a particular way that we don't have a way of measuring, but that I believe is valuable.
Yeah, I agree. And it's something that I think about a lot with poetry in particular, probably all art to some degree or another, but poetry in particular, because so often if I'm asked after reading a poem, what was that poem about, or what happened in that poem, or what was the poet saying in that poem, I really couldn't give you an answer.
Right.
And yet there is some effect that it has on me as the reader, that might not be articulable, but it is still potentially profound. Yeah, I definitely agree with what you're saying. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the title of Hinge, because it's something that, like, there isn't a poem in that collection that is titled Hinge, and even the word itself only kind of appears a couple of times in there. Like we have a front door hinge with its quiet song, or we have a stuck hinge that is loosening at last. And yet there is something about that title that I feel like if I'm thinking about what a hinge does, it supports, but it also bends. It's at the threshold of a room or of a house. It's an inflection point. I feel like all of this is very applicable to these poems, but I wanted to get a little bit, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about sort of what went into the choosing of that word as the title of the collection.
Oh my gosh. It's a good question because it was not a pretty process. So I'm terrible at titles, and I have found ways to compensate for that in poems, but I'm extra terrible at titling collections. And actually, so this book first started circulating under the title First House, which is one of the long sectioned poems in the collection. But that didn't really feel necessarily like a title poem to me. And so then it circulated for a while and actually won the Crab Orchard Open under the title Relic and the Plum, which is also not the title of a poem in the collection, but it's a collection. It's kind of an extraction of a few words from one of the poems. But I never really loved that title. It felt a little forced to me. And so I really relied on my friends, and one friend in particular, Jen Richter, who's a wonderful poet, also has published with the Crab Orchard series. And we just went on this kind of brainstorm bender trying to come up with a title for this book. And I guess Hinge felt right to me in so many ways, even though, as you point out, there is no poem called Hinge in the book. It has enough kind of equivocal qualities that it felt capacious enough, I guess, to call the book Hinge. As you pointed out, hinges both kind of hold a door and it's jammed together. They bend, they open and close. There was also this feeling of a mother being the thing that a family hinges upon. And there was also, I remember Jen and I both kind of saying at the same time and laughing a little bit maniacally about the fact that the unhinged mother, is kind of a trope in our society, or the unhinged woman is a trope in literature. If we think about things like the short story, A Jury of Her Peers. So it worked kind of on so many levels that it felt roomy enough to put the collection under. But the process of finding that title was not pretty.
I like that story. It is something that I feel like there's a certain amount of ambiguity that, like, to me, it almost feels like the title itself, rather than just being a label or some kind of like way of categorizing or pointing to the collection, that it's actually kind of doing something that, at least for me, that the time I spent puzzling over, why is this called Hinge? Like it almost serves as sort of poetic function in and of itself, if that makes sense.
Sure. Like enough mystery. I definitely wanted to avoid a title that overdefined the book. And that's also my preference for any title of any book. And really for any title of any poem, is that it not do too much. You want something that's going to be evocative and interesting, but you don't want to shut out possibility or mystery with a title. So I don't know. I don't know why I'm so bad at titling, but I ended up being comfortable with Hinge. And until I learned several months later that there's a dating app called Hinge. Then I was like, oh my gosh. Well, but by that time the horse had left the barn, and I just went with it.
Yeah.
That will tell you something, that I was not aware that there was a dating app called Hinge until several months after the book was in production. Sometimes
I feel like it might be better for all of us if we didn't know about dating apps.
I could say many things about that. And I have friends and acquaintances who are on the dating apps, and it seems to make everyone miserable. I don't know. My own feeling is that, for most of human history, we found partners without dating apps. And that dating apps have it a little backwards to me, but I think that horse has left the barn too.
So hearing about, talking about the mother as the hinge of the family, or the unhinged mother, the unhinged woman, I feel like there is a lot going on in both of these collections that is sort of either directly or obliquely talking about the ways that women are perceived, the ways that different roles are sort of assigned to women and girls throughout their lives. Like in the collection Hinge, we see poems both from the perspective of the daughter Persephone and the mother Demeter. We see the speaker is sometimes a girl, sometimes a mother, sometimes a wife, sometimes more than one of those things. And yet there's also a way in which these sort of categories feel stifling throughout. And I feel like this is something that you've written about in your prose as well. And the thing that I found interesting in particular about the poems in Hinge, sort of going back to that idea of, or two of the ideas that we've already sort of touched on. One, the idea of your life not going the way that you might have expected. And then two, using poems as a way of finding out what you think about things. There is this sense, I feel, in these poems of that if we have this idea of woman as mother or woman as wife or woman as daughter, and then the narrative of the lived life doesn't fit that anymore, whether through illness or through divorce or something else, that there is this, well, what is there after that? What is there under that? And I do feel like also there is a way in which many of the poems in both collections also talk about containers in a certain way, like whether the container is the body or the container is a room or a house. And the way that the container, on the one hand, it's sort of can be protective from what's on the outside or make things easier to get your arms around, but also limiting in a certain way. And I don't know if I'm entirely off base in this or what, but can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, no, I think you're entirely on base. I think on so many levels, whether we're talking about the body or a room or a house, or the kind of expected role of a woman, a daughter, a wife, a mother. All of those things can be both protective and cherished and limiting and stifling. I think, kind of regardless of the body that I live in and my chronic illness, regardless of what happened, with my marriage and its dissolution, I was probably never going to be a mother who absolutely loved being a mother all the time. And I know plenty of people who are kind of in my camp where they love their children. They would never want to not have them, but that motherhood sometimes feels really difficult for. And I know people who absolutely love being a mother and are dreading the day that their children leave the nest, so to speak. That latter model is the model that society values and the model that society and patriarchy tells girls and women that we need to adhere to. But if that's not your lived experience, then all of that becomes, not just limiting and stifling, but becomes rather like a prison. So I also was never going to be a person who would be quiet about not fitting into that category. I really think girls and women deserve so much more freedom and so much more ability to define themselves and, live the life that feels authentic to them than our society gives us even now. And, we've come a long way since, in some ways, over the years. In other ways, it feels like we're kind of going backwards. But yeah, I think the fact is that, that is my lived experience, that my body, that my physical house, that my role as mother, wife, daughter, sister even, those things feel both like joyful, protective spaces. And they sometimes feel very limiting and unfair and kind of disrespectful of my authentic self. And so navigating that has been just a constant for me since marrying, actually, and then certainly since having children.
The poem, for me, that speaks most directly to this is Most Accidents Occur at Home, which is one that I had actually read as a standalone long before either collection was published. And you had written an essay to go with it for North American Review back in 2016.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, talking about exactly this. And there was a thing that you said in that essay that this poem came into being because I wanted to tell an unlovely truth about family life and not have to take it back.
Yeah.
And the two things about that really struck me, the telling an unlovely truth, because on the one hand, for me, like I get what that means. A lot of the art or even nonfiction about parenthood that has been the most meaningful to me over the years is work that speaks to this unlovely truth. But even if the truth itself is sort of viewed in our culture as an unlovely one, I always have found there's to be something, perhaps lovely isn't exactly the right word, but in the speaking of the truth, that action of speaking it, to be something not just empowering, but beautiful in it. But the thing that really jumped out at me about this quotation is the not have to take it back part. Can we talk a little bit about that a little bit more?
Sure. I have to think about what to say. Yeah, I mean, I think that when I wrote Most Accidents Occur at Home, that's one of the oldest poems in either book. And I was very committed and hardworking at that point, but I did not really understand myself as a poet. I didn't even think of myself as a poet. And I had no aspirations that any of these poems would ever become a book. That just did not seem possible to me at that stage of my life, when I was writing Most Accidents Occur at Home and several other of the poems in Hinge. But I wrote the essay several years later when I did have more of a sense of myself as a poet and as a poet that might have a book someday, although it was still a ways off at that point. And I'm going to talk about the influence of my MFA thesis advisor, David Beispiel, who he was just a great permission giver for me. And one of the things that he said, my notebooks from those years are kind of bejeweled with these little gems that David would deliver. And one of them is the way to get away with something is to write it down and leave it there. And I think that it felt like getting away with something to write about these unlovely truths, right? But at the time that I wrote that essay, I was kind of determined to say what I had to say and not take it back. Because, the other thing is that action, that kind of saying something and then backing away from it when it causes distress is another thing that I think women are taught to do, or at least that I had been taught to do as a girl and a girl growing into a woman, often in order to avoid anger from the men in the house. Say something and then, back it up. I didn't mean it. That's not what I meant. What I meant was this other thing. And I was kind of so tired of that dynamic, both kind of in my life and as I saw it acting itself out in the world, that I guess at a certain point, I had made a promise to myself that I would say what I had to say and I would write it down and leave it there.
I mean, I'm glad that you did. So,
good.
I think we have to move to the break now, because we've been going a while, but, so let's take a little break and then we'll come back and do the second segment.
Okay.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
So I was thinking about this, and I was kind of having a hard time coming up with something, which maybe tells you a little bit about my state of mind these days. I was thinking about, should I talk about an element of craft or, a particular thing I'm reading or whatever. And as usual, I kind of had an insight or something occurred to me while I was doing housework, as often happens for me. So I think what I'd like to talk about is attention.
Okay. Where shall we start?
Yeah, good question. So right now I have more questions than answers, I think, about attention. As I was kind of thinking about it for myself, I think a couple of questions that feel important to me right now are, to what and to whom will I give my attention, or do I give my attention? And what kind of habits of body and of mind and what kind of routines do I need to establish or maybe reestablish in order to pay the kind of attention to the world and to my life that I want to and that I value? I think, my undergraduate degree is in economics. So I think about attention sometimes in terms of the attention economy. Economics is the study of the distribution of scarce resources. And I think about attention and time as scarce resources, I guess. But there's any segment of the world that a person is interested in, the amount of news and discourse and the speed with which that news and discourse are kind of unfolding, I think is kind of mind-boggling.
Indeed.
So whether we're noticing like which stories are getting most attention in the news cycle, or which poets are getting the most attention in the poetry world, everything feels way too fast and way too loud to me. So that's kind of, in some ways, how I've been thinking about, or really asking myself about attention when it comes to my life, because I do feel that my ability to pay attention in the way that I would like to, and to the things that I would like to, has been dulled over the last several years. And I think it's probably because of the news cycle. And I will confess to a propensity to doom scrolling and, the events of my own life, and then the pandemic and all of the political discourse. I think, different people have different responses to all that. I think my response, although I don't really think I understood it as it was happening, I think my response was to become kind of numbed and to forget the habits of mind that help me to pay attention. And then I've also really been thinking a lot about attention in making and poetry. And the questions I've been asking myself there are things like, how does one enact attention on the page? And I think even beyond that, what kind of attention am I asking of my reader? What kind of attention do I want to ask of my reader? So I have, like I said, I have more questions than answers right now, but I'm feeling a really deep need to kind of regroup and reestablish the quality of attention that makes it possible for me to live authentically as a human being and to write authentically as a poet.
Yeah. I suspect that I don't have to suspect, I know that you are not alone in this feeling of having one's ability to focus and concentrate and pay attention closely, having been eroded over the past many years.
Yeah.
And certainly social media and the news cycle and one global crisis after another, or, multiple global crises stacked on top of each other doesn't help.
No. And I'll say that in particular, climate crisis is really hard for me to look at straight on and pay good attention to. I mean, not that I'm not paying attention to that in some way, but there are a lot of threats in this world that I feel like we can definitely do something about if we have enough people of goodwill taking action. But climate crisis is the one thing that, to reuse the metaphor, so sorry, that horse has left the barn. It feels like we are already past, or to an extent, we are already past the point of being able to forestall very serious crisis, right? It's happening now. And we've all seen the news about, the types of emissions reductions we would have to make to avoid this temperature threshold or that temperature threshold. That one's really hard for me to look at attentively because I find it so terrifying. Other crises that we're living in, white supremacy, systemic racism, political dissolution, all of those are also quite terrifying. And of course, the pandemic too, and the idea that many people have that the pandemic's over when it's clearly not. I think I often feel just kind of figuratively bludgeoned by all of it.
Yeah.
And have not, in my own estimation anyway, I haven't done a good job, or I haven't figured out yet how to be engaged in all of those crises, because I believe we have to be, and to also protect my own mental health, my own sense of self, and my own ability to be attentive to the things that I need to be attentive to in order to write my poems and live my life.
Yeah. You and I first connected via Twitter many years ago at this point. I think that there is, especially in 2020, but even before, there was this phrase that would come up over and over again, certainly on my Twitter feed, and I assume on most people's Twitter feeds who are paying even a modicum of attention to current events. And that phrase was, "Don't look away." Mm-hmm. And yet the other sort of metaphor that people use for, in particular Twitter, but social media in general, is as trying to drink from a fire hose. Mm-hmm. I think of it in a certain way as like trying to look at the sun. You're being told not to look away, but you also know that if you keep looking at it, you're going to go blind at a certain point.
Right, right.
I think it's interesting to hear you talking about attention in terms of, giving your attention to these certainly very monumental global crises that are happening. Because for me, the thing that is the most difficult is that I can't get my attention away from those things, that they are such a presence so consistently that it leaves me with very little capacity to give my attention to anything else, including the things that are physically present with me, whether that might be, my housework or my children, my friendships, things like that I have trouble giving my full attention to any of those things because of the way that these crises are sort of constantly present and beckoning my attention. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think a lot of us struggle with that. I seem to have lost my ability to read. Well, let me say that somewhat differently. I can still read poetry and nonfiction. I seem to have lost my ability to read fiction, which is always what I did at night before bed. But now I'm more often reading Twitter, like scrolling through Twitter at night before bed. So I think both kind of the ubiquity of it all, the drinking from the fire hose phenomenon, and the ease with which, it's so easy to just pick up your phone again, right, is not good. And in fact, maybe is perilous in a way. I feel like I've been lately kind of fighting my way back a little bit. I went to a workshop this summer by a poet and essayist, Leah Purpura, who is really my idol in terms of attention. The kind of attention that Leah pays to the world is one that I value very much. And actually, she called it a make shop, not a workshop. So even that phrasing to me said something about what we were trying to be attentive to. But she framed what I'll call the attention economy as kind of an extractive thing. It is capitalism, right? Like Twitter, as we know, is a for-profit company that's trying to make money. And once I kind of had that framing of it being an extractive exercise, that whether we want to say one particular corporation or capitalism writ large is taking from us, that mustered up some will in me that has made it a little easier for me to not just scroll at night.
Yeah.
But certainly, yeah, I worry for my kids too. Like I always tease them, but it's actually not 100% a joke. I always tease him like, I remember when you used to be intellectually curious. And they used to read, and they made art and comics and all kinds of things. And now they just have their phones and they have Snapchat, and they're pretty much young adults at this point. And I'm definitely comfortable with the fact that, that's kind of the water they swim in. And most likely they will come back around to some of the things that were kind of important to them when they were a bit younger, and the values that we tried to instill in them in terms of how we spend our time and energy. But, I don't know that I've been a great role model in some ways, because they're not up at 5 a.m. when I'm up reading and writing. So they don't see that. But yeah, I mean, how to live in this world and be attentive enough to the things that we need to be attentive to, but not overly attentive so that we are being extracted from. And yeah, I don't know.
When it comes to attention, that word always brings to mind for me Mary Oliver. Mm-hmm. And I can never get the phrasing of the line quite right, and also I can never remember which exact poem it is, but she has that line in one of her poems where she says to pay attention, that is our great work, or something like that. Mm-hmm. And for me, something that I've thought a lot about over the past maybe 2 years is how attention can be, well, even just the phrase to pay attention, right? As opposed to give attention.
Yeah.
Putting it in sort of this sort of monetary or capitalistic kind of mode is very interesting. And when you're talking about, the attention economy as being something extractive, but then I come back and think about Mary Oliver and how so clearly, whether or not she was specifically talking about attention or just demonstrating that she was giving her attention to the world around her and what parts of the world she was giving her attention to, how that act is such a generous one, and it is one that is so loving. Mm-hmm. And came to this realization that I think that not all forms of attention, but that love to me is attention, right? Like that what you love is what you want to give your attention to. And when you're successful at it, right, that love and attention are kind of the same thing. And coming around to that way of thinking about it sort of changed a little bit the way that I interact with the world and the way that I interact with people. It's not to say that I'm not still plugged in all the time, because I clearly am. Now it's less Twitter and more TikTok.
Okay. I have not braved the TikTok waters.
It's probably best that you don't.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like to stay relevant to my students and maybe to my children too, because some of them are about the same age, I need to get TikTok fluent, but I'm not.
I mean, the thing is that when you're talking about being extractive, these companies certainly are, they've fine-tuned their algorithms to the point of maximizing people's addictive behaviors, which it's extremely unhealthy. But to me, there's a difference in that kind of attention, because as you say, that is an attention that's being extracted. It's one that is almost being forcibly pulled from you, as opposed to what one gives freely. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And I think what we can do is choose out of the attention economy. I mean, I think that Mary Oliver line exists outside of what I'm calling the attention economy.
Yeah, definitely.
And I remind myself often that the economy is a concept that has been around for less than 200 years, actually. So there's so much, news about the economy, as if we have no power to have a different economy or an alternate economy or whatever, right? So as I think about it, and as I think about what you said about Mary Oliver, the Mary Oliver form of attention, we can choose out of the attention economy. And I think that's one of the areas of life that, sometimes life informs my poetry. Other times poetry informs my life, or my writing practice, what I'm trying to do on the page reminds me about something that I can put to use in my life. So I think right now I'm much better actually at thinking about how to enact attention on the page and how to, create the kind of poems that will elicit the kind of attention I hope to encourage in my reader. But as we talk, I guess I'm kind of saying it out loud to remind myself that we can choose out of the attention economy and start giving rather than paying attention, right? And I think the thing that's hard, of course, is that you almost can't be an adult with a job anymore and not pick up your phone 100 times a day, because so much is done there now that is the actual business of adult life, paying bills, responding to texts from colleagues, etc. But it maybe if a writing practice or a reading practice can teach us about life, that's one way that we can start to choose out of the attention economy and start giving attention instead of paying it.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to do, but
it really is.
Yeah. Hopefully it's something that we can get a little closer towards, at least. And being just aware of it is, I think, it's at least the first step if one wants to step in that direction.
Yeah.
So the last question that I ask all my guests is if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
So, yeah, I mean, there's so much literature and art that matters to me. And I thought of so many writers and artists that I could talk about. But the thing that keeps kind of bugging me is the thing I'm going to talk about, even though I prepared to talk about something different. The protest, the climate protest, in which I believe it was cans of tomato soup were thrown at Van Gogh's sunflowers, is something that I keep thinking about, because to be honest, my first reaction was just kind of horror, like, oh my gosh, they're defacing art. But I feel like that event is asking more of me than horror. Like that was my kind of knee-jerk, perhaps understandable reaction. But I've listened to some interviews with the protesters, and as they have pointed out, it got people's attention, right? Speaking of attention, in a way that the data and the warnings from scientists and the proclamations from politicians have not gotten people's attention. So I think in keeping with the theme of attention here, I've been trying to open myself to thinking about that protest and the interaction of protest and art differently than what my knee-jerk reaction was. I also have been thinking about poetry that happens at the intersection of protest and the lyric, or of the political and the lyric. There are all kinds of proclamations about whether or not a poem is political, whether or not poetry is political. There are some who say if you're not writing political poems right now, what's wrong with you? There are some who say simply the act of writing a poem is a political act. I don't really know about all that, but I have been paying attention to writers who are, I think, very beautifully and expertly and powerfully writing at the intersection of the lyric and the political, or the lyric and protest. Writers like Salma Sharif in her new collection, Customs. I'm just particularly astounded by her ability to navigate the personal and the political and the lyric, all in the same brief poem. And another poet that I've read recently that is doing the same thing, but quite differently, is Dion Brand. in her new series, Nomenclature for the Time Being, which is kind of the beginning sequence of her new and collected, which is called Nomenclature. So yeah, I have this, I don't know if I'm exactly answering your question, but I have this image that I saw, of course, on Twitter while I was doom scrolling, of the sunflowers with the tomato soup on them. And I'm just kind of thinking about what it's asking of me as a person, as a poet. What is it asking of us as human, the human race? What is that? Where does that intersection of protest and lyric, or protest and art, manifest? What should it look like? I mean, I think there's all kinds of quote unquote right answers to that. But I think the moments of discomfort, the moments where art, or some interaction with art in this case, the moments where that can make us feel uncomfortable and kind of stretched in a way that maybe doesn't feel great, are important moments to pay attention to and to sit in. Well, let me revise what I just said. They're important moments to give attention to and sit in.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for talking with me today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it too.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, there are links in the show notes where you can purchase copies of If the House and Hinge. And of course, if you can order them from your own local independent bookstore, so much the better. And check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/likewisemedia to get access to the reading that Molly so generously added to our bonus audio archive. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, the music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help is by Shea Aguinaldo. If you enjoyed today's episode, tell a friend, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser, or, just get in touch with me and let me know. You can find all of those links, contact info, transcripts, and show notes at keepthechannelopen.com. Keep the Channel Open will be back on December 14th for our final conversation of 2022. That will be with poet Abby Miner, so do be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.